Hello, The Walking Dead Dead City Season 1 has come to a close, so it's time for me to grab my cup of coffee and decide whether or not it is in fact worth my morning coffee. It's not actually the morning, but I do still have my coffee and we will talk about it. So, what I've done now is I've created this highly scientific table detailing everything that is important for me when watching The Walking Dead. So we will go through these one by one and finally come to a final grade. I'll talk through these in just a second, but of course, spoilers for the entire series. I'm not going to talk about it super in depth. I'll leave that if I do get to working on a proper retrospective at some point. Here I just want to go over the broader feel of the show, if you will, and talk about the characters briefly and sort of the overarching narrative of the season. So overall, I think it's decent. I'll say that. Like, if you want my one-word review, I think it's decent. As to all the intricacies, well, we'll get to it. So I guess, naturally, let's go through all of my big criteria, right? So what I've done here is I've listed out like the most important factors that are for me. So we start off with tone. For me, if you watch the retrospectives, you will know that when I watch The Walking Dead, I want the tone of The Walking Dead. So that is a bleak survival series with human stories where everything feels grounded. That is The Walking Dead to me. I put the weight, as in, if you don't know how these things are calculated, you just sort of weigh things against one another to sort of figure out what's more important, what's less important. So the grades can be 1 to 10, and then we sort of weigh them against one another. It'll make sense later on, don't worry about it. So for me, the tone is equally important as the macro story, right? So it's not something I feel like is really tangible. It really depends on the person, but of course, obviously, this review is very biased towards me personally. So for me, the tone is very, very important, so I rank it as 25% of the overall grade. And the same goes for the macro story, right? So the overarching narrative. With this one, it is just one arc. It is 6 episodes, so obviously the narrative here is relatively straightforward, So next up, we have characters, and here I'm focusing on the friendly characters, right? So all the side characters and everything like that. And I want to talk about the big bads separately, and those are a bit less important for me because of the story we are going into. So obviously, Negan and Maggie have had backstories going on for, well, Negan ever since season 7, and Maggie ever since season 2, So we know these characters a lot. So if we are going into this entirely new spin-off, the question that I want to ask, which I will ask again later on, is what is the point of this show? How does this further their characters when we already have seasons and seasons of stories with them? And perhaps even more importantly, because the show is so hinged on Maggie and Negan, I want to look at some of the other characters, This has been a large criticism of the later seasons of The Walking Dead as well. The side characters literally do not matter because there are just so many core characters. Because of how many core characters there are, everyone else is just sort of pushed to the wayside, And that is something that is very, very prominent in the later seasons of the main show. So with this being a new spin-off, it only makes sense, I think, to look at the new faces that we see, which was a bit hit and miss. Then, obviously, the big bads, for me, not as important, because, again, this is just 6 episodes. I mean, in Season 1, what did we have? We have sort of Shane being a big bad, but then we just have the Vatos, right? So, even in The Walking Dead, the main series, we didn't really have a big bad for Season 1. And yes, in Dead City, we are, decades into the apocalypse, so there should be, a huge big bad, which I guess there is. But, we didn't really have any big explicit battles or anything like that. It's sort of a looming figure over the season that we sort of need to deal with. So for me, not that important just yet. I do grade also sets and the look as 10%. I don't put it particularly high because I'm not really, don't get me wrong, I do like pretty sets and everything like that. Watching The Last of Us, for example, a huge budget production where every single episode basically had a completely different look. That is really, really cool. But going into Dead City, I think we all sort of knew what to expect. We're going to be seeing a lot of cityscapes, and that was great. We'll get to it a bit more, but compared to the narrative and the tone, I don't think it's actually particularly important. Like we've seen with the main series, right? Season 2 takes place on a single location. It's very, very, very low budget, but the story was very, very strong. And then we get to the prison, which is obviously a lot more budget, but still the setting itself is sort of isolated by design. So for me, when it comes to The Walking Dead, the sets and the look is great, but not super important. If it's there, then great. Finally, novelty. The question we're all asking, and do not answer with the word money. I do realize money is the most important thing in all of this, but let's not just say money, okay? Why does the show exist? Like I said with the characters, we have decades of history with all of them. What is the point of this show? What are we going to be talking about? What is the story? why does this need to exist, you know? This is a spin-off about two characters that have already had the same exact dynamic, so what makes this show different, and how does it progress their characters? I grade this as only 10%, and also in terms of novelty, is not just because of, like, their characters, it's also just because of, like, what else are they trying to do with the series, you know? Like, sure, Maggie and Negan are the forefront characters, but how else is it different from the main series? So, for me, these are the things I sort of weigh everything against, and I gave each of these a grade, which then leads us to this sort of incremental grade, which then adds up into the final one. So, let's just go one by one, and I'll talk about them as we go on. So let's start with the most important one, the tone. As I said, for me, The Walking Dead, bleak survival series with human stories, feels grounded. There is not goofiness abound, you know, even when we have characters like Negan, Negan is still even in the comic book, when he is super goofy, he throws out like 50 swear words in a row, he does a bunch of goofy things. Everything around that is still like very, very grounded, you know? The tone for me in The Walking Dead has always been super important. We are following characters that are not protagonists. We are following just some dude, you know, like Rick throughout the series. Yes, he is the protagonist. Yes, he is sort of the hero. But at the end of the day, he is just some dude, you know. He doesn't take W's all the time. He takes a lot more L's, actually. I even have a little meme going in the retrospectives of the incomplete edition of injuries that Rick has had, you know, which is like a ridiculous number. For Dead City, the grade for that is a 4, for a few very specific reasons. So, in Season 10 and Season 11, I think the writers of the main series had this weird obsession with making characters like the heroes, you know? And not heroes in the sense that I just said with Rick, but heroes in the sense that they can do no wrong. Even when they do something that is, like, by all accounts, a relatively bad thing, nothing bad ever happens. You know, they're not punished for bad actions. And while that isn't particularly prominent in this series, I feel like the tone of Maggie being this unstoppable force of nature is still there. And like, even way, way back in like the first episodes, she is addressed as the Widow, which is like, okay, makes sense. You know, we had the Widow, Rick, and the King, right? Which is cool, I guess. It still feels a bit goofy because, I mean, there's not a lot of people around, but, you know, just giving a title to a character gives it this odd sense of, like that they're a walking myth, which I don't like. For me, The Walking Dead shouldn't be, like, people are walking around with titles, you know? This isn't like Game of Thrones, the Kingslayer or whatever. I don't want characters to have titles. And then, this one is particularly fresh on my mind, but in the season finale, we have Maggie stab Negan. Nothing happens. She stabs Negan, it is never addressed. Not even for a split second it is ever addressed. Negan literally takes a knife to his shoulder, and that's it. That's where the scene ends. Like, they jump off, which, by the way, also the hero landing of Negan looks so goofy. Like, the fact that they're jumping around with knives in their hands, but like, okay, that is just a Walking Dead fight sequence, I don't even care at this point. Point is, he was stabbed, and that is never even talked about. Which is like, what? It's small things like that, which is why I keep saying the bleak tone of The Walking Dead, you know? An injury is still an injury. Even if it's not a major injury, like, you should at least do something about it. Like, you just got stabbed, you know? And that is never addressed. It just seems odd to me. Which, like, just makes the scenes carry basically zero meaning, you know? Also, in terms of, I guess we'll talk about this with the characters as well. But in terms of the tone, when it comes to Negan as well, it feels like a lot of the Ginny stuff is sort of just used as, she's almost used as a prop, which is just like super weird, but we'll talk about that with characters. And again, that's sort of the overarching narrative of Negan, and how is it different from what we've already seen. But again, all of these sort of bleed together, because I feel like the tone bleeds into everything else we'll be talking about. So I guess let's just move on to the macro story, right? The macro story, I gave a decent 7 out of 10. You know, it's nothing groundbreaking, but it's not bad either. Like, Maggie looking for Herschel is interesting. And actually, like, I don't know if this is a hot take. I haven't been on Reddit or anything. Honestly, I've been following Dead City, like, super casually, because it hasn't blown me away. I'll say that, you know. Maggie looking for Herschel is easily the most interesting stuff to me, and Herschel's character is easily the most interesting character to me in the entire series so far. What we see with Herschel in the finale is literally, like, those couple of minutes alone made the season worth watching for me. I don't care about Maggie and Negan basically at all at this point, I'm gonna be honest. I just want to see how the effects of all-out war and the effects of everything that has happened to Maggie has affected Herschel, right? And this is something that is addressed very, very briefly. If you have not read the comic, spoilers, is addressed very, very briefly at the end of the comic book, right? So when Herschel grows up, he is an absolute insufferable brat. No one likes him. Herschel is very, very hateable for the simple reason that Maggie never had the time to like properly look after him with everything they were doing, you know? It's sort of this tragic reality of her having this kid, but you know, things don't, like, this isn't a fairy tale, you know? She was busy with everything else, and so Herschel sort of grows up as a bit of a brat, you know? I think I talked about this in my earlier reviews as well, but this is something that has also been addressed in things like Avatar, for example, you know? And I feel that it is a very realistic and very, very interesting way of looking at it, that even though, yes, Rick, Maggie, and all these leaders are the chosen ones, you know, to an extent, again, to a very limited extent, it's not that they can do no wrong. And I feel like the comic book handled that very, very well, and I'm really, really excited to see how the TV show handles this, because I do think Herschel being not at all like Glenn, but him being the spitting image of Glenn, is going to be very, very interesting to see, and I hope we get to see more of that in future seasons as well. The rest of the macro story, though, I was not intrigued at all. It is very straightforward, but the thing is, like, if I compare it to Rick's story in season 1, you know, that took 2 episodes, and everything there was novel. Here, nothing really is new. We've seen traversing the apocalypse. Sure, we have not seen the city, but we have already dealt with baddies before, and this whole thing takes place over 6 episodes, you know? Nothing in these episodes was particularly groundbreaking for me to want to follow this journey across the city for 6 episodes. We'll talk about this with Novelty as well, but again, we don't have any intelligent walkers, we don't have any of that in this series, which still seems a bit odd. We will address that probably with Daryl's show. So far, no intelligent walkers whatsoever, which does feel a bit odd, considering they were teased at the end of season 11, which, by the way, is also something people seem to misunderstand. They are supposed to be in the US as well. It's not just that they're in France. They were when Aaron saw them, you know, that's why we talked about them in I think it was season 11. They do exist, and we are in a particularly densely populated area, so where are they? You know, it's pretty much a sake of probabilities, and we haven't seen any. Which, also talking about the macro story, the story takes place in the city, and there are hordes, but we don't see basically any hordes. We saw a little bit of that at the very, very start, but the rest of the story sort of takes place like underground, you know, like a lot of the episodes were in the tunnels, and then when we emerge on the streets don't really seem particularly dangerous. And yes, I do suppose we are decades into the apocalypse. Then it sort of feels inconsistent, because one moment we have a horde, next moment it's dead silent. You know, it feels a bit flip-floppy and very convenient, which again links back to the tone, where it sort of feels like I'm not immersed in the story, it feels like I'm watching a story, you know, whereas when I was following Rick, it felt a lot more organic, the things he ran into. Again, all links back to the tone. Moving on to the characters, though, I gave it a 5. You know why? Because I don't care about basically anyone, and Herschel was interesting, and I hope we get to see more of him. Ginny was interesting, and I thought she could be used for a lot more, until she just sort of turned out to be a prop to make Negan seem like a good guy, and then seem like a bad guy. Like, my biggest takeaway from this is the scene we have, I believe it was in the finale, right? When Negan tells her that he killed her father, you know, and she just runs off. First off, that entire scene seemed a bit jarring to me. It felt like there was a bit missing in between, because he says, I killed your father, and she just runs off. That's it. That's the entire scene. Which was like, guess it makes sense, but I kind of feel like there was a bit in between missing. But okay, that doesn't even matter. My biggest takeaway is that I kind of hope Negan lied. I kind of hope he didn't kill her father, and he only said that to make her hate him and get away from him, you know? Because then we would at least have some sort of complexity where Negan really, really cares about her, which, by the way, I'll talk about this with Novelty, but, like, can we stop giving random kids to Negan to make him look like a good guy? Like, we get it. He likes kids. We've had how many of them now? We get it. Enough. Stop it. we really do get it. Then we would at least have some complexity, right? Where he sort of pushes her away to protect her. And I think that would be, it is a very much a trope, but at least it would be something that makes Negan a bit more a bit more interesting in terms of his morality, I suppose. Whereas right now, it's just like, he looked after her because he cares about her, because he sort of killed her father, and then you sort of have this... It is interesting to an extent, because, like, yeah, does he feel indebted to her, or does he really care about her? And that is also an interesting thing to explore, but, I mean, the obvious answer, I think, is yes, Negan. Negan is a very, very different guy right now, so I do think he just cares about her. But, like, Ginny's character just feels very surface level right now, and as much as I want to know more about her, like, her suddenly speaking in the finale was excellent. Like, again, we are not retreading the same story beats, because Ginny is a character that did not speak, right? Her trauma, she doesn't speak. And that is something we haven't seen in The Walking Dead before. And that is a very, very important thing, by the way, with something as long-running as The Walking Dead. I liken Maggie's search for Herschel to Rick, right? We have covered so many stories that you can't draw these direct parallels. So Ginny, in that sense, is not just a random kid that Negan looks after. You know, there is at least some new angle to her. But unfortunately, throughout these first 6 episodes, she genuinely feels like a bit of a prop, and I kind of hate that. You know, I feel like there is so much potential with her that we just literally never saw, which is unfortunate. I hope we get to see more of her in the future. I don't really know how that would look like. Guess we'll see how Negan's usual adopted kid turns out this time. Big bads. So for the big bads, I gave a 7. Why did I give a 7? Because they're decent, but they don't feel like The Walking Dead. They feel too over the top, and I also said this in one of my first reviews of the series, it feels like Dying Light, you know, if that makes sense. It is this crime boss that doesn't really fit into the Walking Dead universe for me, and that is why I have it at a 7 and not lower, because I feel like the tone accounts for that, you know. I do find it interesting that Croat has the, I don't remember the lady's name, right, but the one that looked after Herschel, supposedly, and chopped off his toe, which is something, again, from Herschel's perspective, I'm really, really looking forward to, because Herschel clearly feels that Maggie has been so obsessed with Negan that she's sort of lost her way, and she sort of doesn't even really care about him that much. And I want to see how this lady, whose name I don't remember, plays into Herschel's story, right? Does he maybe have a bit of Stockholm Syndrome going on or something like that? I feel like that would be really, really interesting to explore. But Croat feels like, this is something I also said in the retrospective, it feels more comic booky than the comic book. And that is hard to pull off, you know? It's very hard to pull off. I wish we got to see more grounded villains. And also, if we talk about sort of villains and the grounded aspect of those, earlier in the season, the scene of Negan, like, smashing the dude's face through the glass, right? And then everyone just runs away, scared. That's a bit of an anime moment, and I don't really like that either. There were a bunch of these scenes where we got to see these antagonists that it feels, again, not like an encounter, but like a story. It's hard to get immersed because of how they're written. You know, this might just be a me thing, but that's how I honestly felt about it. And Croat is, like, over the top to the nth degree. Alright, so the next thing, sets and the look. I gave this a very respectable 8 out of 10. And the reason why I don't give it a perfect 10 out of 10, which I would do, is because as much as the sceneries were really cool looking, I feel like we didn't really explore them that much. You know? And this isn't just me hating on the ziplines, because I think the ziplines were dumb. I think the ziplines are from Dying Light, and I don't want Dying Light in my Walking Dead. I think just some of the scenery, which sort of also links back to the Hordes, I feel like we didn't get to explore the unique aspects of where we operate, you know? It feels like a backdrop more than it does an actual setting, you know? I think they've done a great job of portraying a very different setting, you know, which is why I do give it a very respectable 8 out of 10. But I don't think we really explored what that means for the story. Many times already, even in the retrospectives as well, I said I want to see the survivors going to a city because cities have a lot of walkers. Here, we get to see some of that, but like I said earlier, it's never really fully explored. So it is sort of there, but never really there. Curious to see how they handle this in season 2. I'm not even sure we were going to return to the city, honestly. Right now, I am getting a bit of crime boss vibes of Maggie and Negan, like with the final scene. I don't know, I just wish we get to see more of what like the zombie apocalypse in New York actually looks like, you know? Though, in terms of looks, very, very good. So not much else to say there. I think they've done a great job of making it look very different from the from Forest number 394 from the mainline series, you know? And finally, novelty. So the important question of why does this show exist? So like I said before, the constant bickering of Maggie and Negan we've done this millions of times already. You know, this has been played up to the nth degree. Maggie's story of her going off to do something on her own has also happened multiple times already, both due to in-story circumstances as well as Maggie just leaving the show. What is the story of this show? You know, what does it do for us that hasn't been done before? And here, I give it an 8. Might seem high, considering how much I've said that, like, the whole Maggie Negan stuff has been overdone to death, but the novelty angle for me is pulled up because of where we're operating in, right? And here, I do have to I have to turn on my critical brain and turn off my old man, I want the Walking Dead brain, you know? As much as I don't like the whole zipline stuff and the whole us operating in this somewhat whimsical setting and everything like that, it does feel very, very different. They are trying new things, you know? This is different from the main show in a both good, but for me personally kind of bad way, because I think it's moving away from the core of The Walking Dead. Story-wise though, like I said with the characters and with the main story, you know, I try to isolate these as much as possible because I don't want like everything to just bleed through, because I don't like the overall tone of the series, you know. They are trying new things, and as much as I don't like the grappling guns, I think they're silly, I think they're not practical, I think they're just dumb, you know, like even in season 10, Daryl is using a Morning Star, which is the dumbest weapon of all time that no one has ever used because it's just dumb and that's not a good weapon. You know, it's things like that. They're new, but I don't like them, but they are new. So I will be giving it an 8 out of 10. Also because, like, again, we are in a city that is different. The characters are different. We don't have a bajillion, like, weird Easter eggs and stuff like that are just, like, basically baiting fan service, you know? Like, oh, hey, look at this, you recognize this. And things like that, you know, like in other Walking Dead spin-offs, it's constantly CRM this, CRM that, you know. It feels like Dead City is trying to do its own thing, which I do respect. Again, might not be exactly for me, but it's different. So that's all that matters. I want them to try different things, even though, yes, it is a spin-off of an already decade-long series, you know. The novelty, I give an 8. Let us sum all this up, and let us see the final grade, which I haven't seen yet myself. So what does this amount to? This amounts to 6.05, which seems sort of like, yeah, what I'd expect. Maybe I'd give it a little bit higher if I added like a bit more incrementality. So it might be like a 6.5 or something, but 6 seems decent. Yeah, that is, I think, how I feel about it. I think they're trying a lot of new things, and the main story itself, it's simple, but it works. You know, like Maggie going after Herschel. Herschel's character is interesting, is very different from everything we've seen before, and it does set itself apart from all the other kids' stories we've seen thus far. I know a lot of people are sick of teenagers in the apocalypse, but like, personally, I don't think it's a problem. I think a lot of these sort of more volatile characters are actually very interesting to explore. You know, because that's sort of the thing. Like, people keep saying someone's acting dumb when they're a teenager. Like, that's kind of the point, you know. And with Herschel, I feel like that is very, very interesting as well. So we'll see how that turns out. But the tone is not there for me. Like, this, for me, this doesn't have the heart of The Walking Dead, if that makes sense. But yes, that is my overall review. So, the most important question. You are waking up in the morning, and you have one thing to watch in the morning while having your coffee. Is it worth it? I think it is. I think if you enjoyed the main series, I think this is worth a watch. This is much, much better than Tales of the Walking Dead, I'll say that. It is a lot more involved, and while some of these side characters really don't amount to much, I think the core story is strong enough and interesting enough to follow. Especially, like, if you're a fan of Maggie and Negan, then I think this is an easy watch. If you think their bickering has gotten old about 5 years ago, then don't watch this, you know? Because it's... a lot of it is basically the same thing all over again, you know? I'm still excited to see all the other spin-offs, but this one, I think it's off to a decent start, and it definitely feels a lot more interesting than Fear right now, I will say that. I hope we see more of it. It does, like, obviously the first thing people said is, this is something I have actually seen. People said the first season is just set up for the second season, which I do agree with. Like, it does feel a bit odd that the entirety of the first season was just set up, because, you know, like, it can be set up, but it shouldn't be that the entire first season is set up and it doesn't have any conclusion. I don't think it's particularly true, because we sort of do get Herschel, and it's just that we realize Herschel wasn't exactly who we thought he was. So I do think there is a conclusion there, but I do feel like the way it leans on a second season is a bit too much. And do keep in mind, with the writer's strike going on, there's going to be a very long wait for season 2. So we'll see whether or not people actually hold on to that little tidbit. But anyway, that is my overall thoughts. So my final review, my scientific review, I guess is a 6. And if I'm feeling particularly generous, then maybe 6.5. You know, if I push some of these boundaries a little bit and try to be a bit more incremental. But yes, do let me know whether you enjoyed it. I am a bit, you know, down on the Walking Dead franchise as a whole. Based on what we've seen, I do think the Daryl show actually does look a bit more grounded, despite some of the, you know, the shit, you know. Other than that, it does feel a bit more down to earth. We'll see though. Obviously, we've just seen a few trailers. The Rick and Michonne show also looks interesting. I'll be watching all those, so you can expect a lot more of these from me as well. But you know, it is what it is, basically. I think it's an interesting show, it just doesn't really feel like The Walking Dead that much to me. Anyway, hope you enjoyed my ramblings. Again, do let me know what you thought, and then I'll see you back, I guess, for the next Walking Dead spin-off when we get to it. Alright, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you whenever I see you. Bye-bye.